A lot of people have asked me, how do I get better macro photography? Well, in this short video, we're going to talk about a few equipment choices and techniques to do just that. To better understand close-up and macro photography, first let's talk about magnification. Different magnifications are created by placing space in between the lens and the sensor. And what this does is bends the light so that it makes the subject seem larger than what it really is. To demonstrate this, I'm going to place a penny about 27 inches away from the camera. Now, to replicate what the lens is doing, I'm just going to place a regular magnifying glass between the penny and the camera. Now, by doing this, you can see that so far, just by putting the magnifying glass in front, the magnification hasn't really changed that much, and that's because we haven't really moved it very far away. It's about 7 inches from the lens to the sensor, so not a whole lot has changed. Now in this next image, as you can see, we've moved the magnifying glass a little bit farther away. At this point, it's about 10 inches from the lens to the sensor, and we can start to see just a little bit of difference in the penny size. This is because we're actually creating space in between and sort of using the optics to blow that penny up a little bit. Now in this last image, you can see that we've blown the penny up quite a bit from where it was when we first started. I've got it at about 22 inches from the lens to the sensor. That's about arm's length almost. And we've blown it up quite a bit. And this is simply by using optics and space in between. In macro photography, one of the main ways that we measure magnification is by judging it from life size. Life size, or one-to-one magnification, is basically the size of the image compared to the size of the sensor, and that depends on what sensor you're using. In this case, just to demonstrate how big it's going to look, I used this 35mm slide mount to show the area that represents what your regular 35mm sensor would be like. Now, for those of you who use the APS-C sensor size, otherwise known as crop frame, this is the area that would represent that life size magnification. And as you can see, the APS-C sensor gives a little bit more of a crop, so you've actually got a little bit more of an advantage when you're trying to get to those larger magnifications. So what kind of equipment do you need to have to get you to some of these larger magnifications? Probably one of the easiest and most economic ways of getting there would be the use of extension tubes. Extension tubes place space between the lens and the camera. They're basically nothing more than just spacers that go in between the lens and the camera to create that space that we need that provides us that magnification. There's also no optics involved, so that retains the lens quality of the original lens. They're also relatively inexpensive compared to most other options. They work on any lens, so you can use them on any lens that you already own. You can use them on macro lenses, you can use them on telephotos, wide angles, whatever. You can also use them in any combination. So what are the bad points of extension tubes? Well, for one thing, you lose infinity focus. So what that means is by creating that space that we need to do the magnification for close-ups, you also lose the ability to shoot that lens as a normal scenic lens. So to resume your normal scenic photography, you would have to then take the extension tubes off. There's also a loss of light, and that's going to depend a lot on which tube you use. If you use a shorter one, it might only be a half a stop or so, but if you use a big one or a bunch of them combined together, it might be as much as 3 stops. Now with today's, modern automatic cameras, it's going to compensate for that, but you must be aware that you are still losing shutter speeds, so it's going to slow you down a little bit. I would, however, urge you to use caution in buying extension tubes because there's all different types and all different types of quality levels. So if you get some, make sure that you get some that retain the metering and autofocus values. This isn't exactly necessary, but it certainly makes it a lot more handy when you're trying to focus on things and metering things. At least this way, if you get a fully automatic set, you don't have to worry about that. It's one less thing to be worried about when you're trying to take a picture of something. Also, if you're going to get some, try and get some with metal mounts. Avoid the plastic kind. The main reason for this is because of flexing and binding on the heavier extensions. Cost can range greatly on extension tubes. They can be anywhere from $11 for a whole set of them to $140 for a single tube. Now, $140 is a little bit of overkill, I think, but I also would avoid the really cheap ones. If I were to go for something, I'd probably say somewhere in the $80 to $100 range is probably a good bet. That way you're going to get a good quality extension tube that's going to last you probably the rest of your life, and you're not going to be putting your other equipment in jeopardy by getting something so cheap that it ruins your equipment. So how much extension do you need to get to life size? Well, that depends a lot on the focal length of your lens that you're using. In this case, let's say I'm using a 40 millimeter lens. To get to life size with this lens, with this focal length, I'm going to need 40 millimeters of extension. That's because that for any given focal length, you need exactly that same amount of extension behind it to get to life size. So for a 40 millimeter lens, I would need to use about a 36 millimeter extension tube to get me to at least close to life size. If I were to use a full extension tube set of 68 millimeters, with that same 40 millimeter lens, that gets me to 1.5 times life size. With this relatively lightweight combination, I can get some pretty large magnifications out of it. One of the other really great benefits of using extension tubes is that you don't always have to use them with macro photography. You can also add them to, say, a telephoto for making them focus closer. For example, here I have a short 12 millimeter extension tube on a 300 millimeter lens. This lens normally focuses at about a minimum of 8 feet. However, if I put a 12 millimeter extension tube on it, it now focuses down to 6 feet. This enables me to get much closer to smaller subjects. Really short extension tubes can be used with wide-angle lenses to make them also focus closer. But there are a few tricks with this. First, you'll have to manually lock the focus at infinity. When you're dealing with wide-angle macros like this, your working distance is going to be very, very short. Therefore, the tube itself must be a very short extension tube. Otherwise, focus will actually be behind the front element of the lens. For example, if you tried to use, say, a 20 millimeter extension tube on a 17 millimeter lens, it's not going to work because, well, the extension is longer than the lens itself. What you then end up with is a very bizarre situation where the actual infinity of the focus of the lens is behind the actual front element of the lens. This means that you can't actually get close enough to your subject to actually get it all in focus. Because of this, you have to be very careful of the front element of the lens because you're, in most cases, practically touching the subject. This is where zoom lenses like a 17 to 40 or 16 to 35 come in very handy because once you set where you want it, you can kind of tweak it and zoom in just a little bit just to get beyond that point and bring things into more of a focus. If you find you like this sort of thing, there are specially made ultra-wide-angle macros available. Here's a pretty straightforward use of extension tubes. In this case, I was taking pictures of this spring peeper on a blade of grass. I used a full-frame film camera at the time, and I used a 55mm lens. It's just a normal 55mm lens that comes with the camera. I used 62mm of extension behind it to get to a little bit greater than life size. Here's a very high magnification shot of a penny. Are there any guesses as to what I might have used to get this kind of shot? Believe it or not, it was a toilet paper roll core, which is about 100mm. I am doing this just to demonstrate that extension tubes are really just that, pretty much just a tube. In this case, I used an old 55mm lens. It's a manual lens, and I just perfectly fit the core over the back end of the lens and then held it up to the camera and took the picture. Now, this is an APS-C sensor on this particular camera, and it gives me approximately 2.5 times life size magnification. Now, obviously, I wouldn't recommend this as a regular thing to be taking your pictures with because it's just not very practical. But I just wanted to demonstrate that there's really nothing fancy to extension tubes, and they really aren't, the kind of thing that you should be paying $140 for. So what about macro lenses? Whenever we think about macro photography, obviously this is the first type of lens that comes to mind. Macro lenses are really nothing more than regular lenses with built-in extension. This means that you can use them for scenics or wildlife or anything like that, but then also turn right around and usually get close-ups with them. And a lot of times, depending on the lens manufacturer, you can go all the way up to life size with that lens. Another benefit of macro lenses is that they can focus at infinity. This makes it very handy because you can take a flower picture or something like that, turn right around, take a scenic with the same lens. Macro lenses are also very sharp. They're produced in such a manner that they're made mostly for what's called flat field photography, meaning things like stamp collections or coins or things like that, copy work. But they can, of course, be used for nature subjects or anything else. And they also make great portraiture lenses. The other thing about them is that they come in many different focal lengths. You can get macro lenses that are 50mm or I prefer something like 100mm, something like that. But they also go all the way up to 180 or 200mm. It just really depends on what style of macro photography you want to achieve. So what are the downsides of macro lenses? Well, there's really only one: the cost. And actually, I would say, for the most part, it's worth it. Depending on the manufacturer, they could range anywhere from maybe $400 or $500 all the way into the thousands. Now, one thing to note is that there are a lot of manufacturers that offer macro lenses that really aren't macro lenses in that they don't actually go to full life size all by themselves. However, they do close-up photography. They are rather limited sometimes in how they do it. For instance, they might be stuck on just one focal length in a zoom or something like that. They're a good option if you want to get started in it, but if you really want to do actual macro stuff, you should probably go for an actual macro lens. I used a 100mm macro lens to get this red maple leaf on haircap moss. Now, I could have used a regular 55mm or something like that with extension tubes on it, but it was just a lot handier to have a macro lens with me. I just really like the 100mm perspective. It just gives me a unique focal length to kind of isolate the subject and bring out just a certain section of the scene that I want to show. As I said before, you don't always have to use macro lenses for macro photography. You can back it off a little bit and just take close-up photography. And like in this case, a Western skink, I used a Canon 7D, which is a crop frame camera, with a 100mm macro lens. This gives me approximately a 160mm angle of view. These lizards are rather wary of humans, so it's really important to have a longer focal length so I can keep my distance and still get some really good close-up shots. Crab spiders hunt their prey by camouflaging themselves in flowers. They then wait for their prey to come along and feed on the nectar, and they pounce on them. However, these spiders are also very wary of humans. Again, I used a 100mm macro lens on a crop frame to get this image. A single on-camera flash was used to illuminate the scene. So what other equipment options are there? Well, there's supplementary lenses, also known as diopters or close-up filters. These are basically filters that you screw into the front end of your lens. They're generally low in cost, ranging from $15 to $60 for pretty good sets. Some of the better ones are $25 to $150 for single filters. This is one situation where you might want to spend a little bit more because you're actually buying a lens element. And if you're going to buy a lens element, it's best to buy it from somebody that actually knows how to make a lens. I would suggest brand names like Nikon or Canon, or if you're going to go third party, try B&W. One of the really good benefits of these supplementary lenses is that there's no light lost. This means that you can basically just screw it onto the front end of the lens and not have to really worry about anything as far as your shutter speeds changing or anything like that. This quality of not having any light lost really aids in using zoom lenses, since a lot of zoom lenses will actually change their aperture setting depending on where they're at in the zoom. Supplementary lenses are also very lightweight and transportable. This can be really handy when you're trying to keep it light by backpacking into a place, or maybe you're traveling and you want to just keep your weight down. However, one thing to keep in mind is that it is an extra lens element, and so there might be a slight loss of quality. This does depend on what brand you get, and that's again where I would say go for those better brands. They're usually also not very strong. You're not going to be getting really high magnifications out of these things. So what about reverse mounting a lens? Well, this is also a good option. However, it does come with a few costs. By reverse mounting a lens, we're basically turning it into a magnifying glass that you're mounting on the front of your camera. It's using the same glass that you already own, but you're just bending the light in a different way. This involves buying a small metal mount that basically screws onto the front of your lens, but instead of a filter, it has the same mount that that the rear of your lens has. So what you do is you turn your lens around and mount it opposite direction onto the body of your camera. These adapters are actually pretty low in cost, usually ranging around $15, which is a pretty good deal for a macro setup. Again, they're very lightweight. And you're also getting a very high quality magnification because you're using your really good lens that you already own. The downside, though, is that by doing this, you're disconnecting all of the electronic or mechanical connections to the camera body. This means that autofocus, metering, and all of your data will not show up and won't work. So having the ability to manually adjust things is necessary for this type of macro photography. One of the other downsides is that by doing this, you have a very short working distance, usually very close to the subject. This, of course, also exposes the rear elements of the lens, which is something you really don't want to do very often. Another optional equipment choice would be teleconverters. Normally, teleconverters are used in conjunction with telephoto lenses to multiply their focal length. However, in macro photography, when used behind extension, you can multiply the extension and not the focal length. However, there's a couple things you should keep in mind when trying to use teleconverters for macro photography. For one thing, there will be a slight loss of optical quality due to the fact that you, again, are adding extra elements to the situation. And there will be a loss of light, usually only about a stop or two. The main problem is that most teleconverters aren't compatible with certain lenses. This is mostly due to the fact that a lot of modern teleconverters are made with only telephotos in mind. They have a large forward-facing element that projects out into the telephoto lens. If when used with a regular lens that doesn't have any provision for this element, it could cause damage to your lens. One way to get around this is to use older teleconverters that don't have this element, or you can use an extension tube to act as a spacer in between. Let's take a look at a setup that uses this example. Here we have a 40mm lens again with 68mm of extension. This gets us to about 1.5 times life size. When we add a 1.4 teleconverter to the whole situation, we again multiply that by 1.4 times, giving us about 95mm of equivalent extension. This comes to just a little bit over twice life size. It's really interesting what you can do when you start combining some of these things like a macro lens with extension tubes. Using a crop frame camera, I was able to get a frame-filling shot of this mosquito as it landed on my arm. It's funny what I'll do sometimes to get a shot. In this case, I let her feed on me for a while to get her abdomen filled up with blood. I knew that as soon as she was finished, she would fly away, so I had to be prepared because I only had 1 or 2 shots at this situation. Since I was using one arm as my prop, I had to use just one hand sliding up and down my arm to keep focus on this. When you're dealing in very high magnifications, it's hard to try and get everything in focus because your depth of field is so shallow. Using flash in this situation really helps stop the action because you can use a smaller aperture to keep more stuff in focus, but yet stop the action with the flash. When I took this picture of red clover, I certainly had other equipment that I could have used. Unfortunately, I didn't have it with me at the time. So what I did use is a 55mm lens with 35mm of extension. I then put a 2x teleconverter on the back of it to multiply the extension that was used. When dealing with very limited depth of field, I find it better to try and focus on whatever's in front and then just kind of letting the rest of the picture fall out of focus. I'd like to talk a little bit about technique and composition. In macro, as with most photography, we want to be able to tell a story and draw the viewer into the photo. We also want to evoke emotion and interest in the subject. For me, one of the most rewarding parts of photography is being able to inspire others to have an interest in nature. One of my favorite macro subjects is spiders. However, I know that a lot of people just simply don't like spiders. But if I can present a spider in a really beautiful setting or show off their colors or show off their amazing, unique behavior, sometimes that's just enough to get somebody's interest in something. They still might not like spiders, but at least they're interested. A stock photography agent once told me that landscapes are the most photographed subject. However, wildflowers, or just flowers in general, are the second most popular subject. They are indeed one of the most easiest things to take macro pictures of, and they truly do inspire us with their beauty. If you want to be a little bit creative and different, try black and white for your macro shots. It can create a whole different feel. I'd like to take a moment to talk about stability and the use of tripods. Obviously, sharpness is going to be one of the main things people think of when they think of using a tripod. However, they do much more. For me, they act as an extra hand, a way to hold on to the camera and assess the situation and see if it's really what I want to take a picture of. Also, they reduce fatigue. If you've ever been in the situation where you're trying to do a low-angle macro shot, the wind is blowing, or you're waiting for something, sometimes the tripod really helps out. But most importantly, they force you to slow down and really examine and fine-tune your composition. For this shot of this 8-spotted skimmer on spotted knapweed, I used a tripod to position myself in just such a way to get a really good shot. When taking pictures of something like a spider web with dew on cold mornings, your body can actually create a little bit of a microclimate in the cold air. If you're close enough to a spider web when this happens, it creates a little bit of wind. This in turn will constantly keep the spider web flowing and in and out of focus. By using a tripod and setting up my shot, I was able to back away from the situation for a few moments, let the wind die down, and then come back in for the actual shot. A longer focal length also helped. If your camera is equipped with a depth of field preview button, be sure you use it. It's a really great feature to be able to mechanically stop the lens down and actually see what your lens is going to take. Now, if you don't have this, don't worry. You could also have Live View do it if you have Live View. It really aids in trying to see what the background is going to look like once you stop the lens down. A portable diffuser is also a really great accessory to have with you for macro and close-up photography. It will diffuse the harsh light. It creates even lighting, and most are very compact. They come in a variety of sizes, and I like the ones that kind of scrunch up into your backpack. Most diffuser sets will also come with a set of reflectors. The reflective material then stretches around the diffuser frame, and you can use it for warm lighting or neutral lighting. I was in the southern Appalachian Mountains when I found this crested dwarf iris. Unfortunately, the sun dappling through the forest at the time made for very harsh lighting. A diffuser was the answer. It created a nice even lighting to make more contrast and really pump up the colors. There are all sorts of techniques to use for different types of close-up photography. I really like posterized backgrounds. I like simplifying the subject by isolating it and showing off all its detail. Here, for this teasel, I used a 300mm lens. I was actually out shooting wildlife at the time and didn't have any macro equipment. So again, I just used what I had. If you want to try some close-up photography with a wide-angle lens, really one of the easiest ways to do it is by using a point-and-shoot camera or sometimes just your cell phone. I just find it really interesting to be able to get at different angles and different views and trying to get a different perspective on things. Well, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed this short tutorial of macro and close-up photography. Be sure to check out some of my other photography at www.bflintphotography.com.